Bonjour, merci d'être venu donc au CEL pour cette conférence de Peter Stockwell, qui est professeur à l'université de Nottingham, au Royaume-Uni. Peter Stockwell est spécialiste de stylistique cognitive. Il a publié en 2002 un livre qui s'appelle Cognitive Forensics, qui est au programme de nos divers masters. Il vient d'ailleurs de faire une série de conférences à la Manufacture des tabacs sur la stylistique cognitive. Il a entre autres publié des ouvrages en sociolinguistique et sur la langue anglaise en général, une douzaine d'ouvrages, donc soit des monographies, soit des recueils d'articles. Et notamment en sociolinguistique, il est l'auteur d'un ouvrage qui s'appelle Sociolinguistics, publié chez Routledge en 2007 pour la deuxième édition. Il a aussi coédité un ouvrage avec deux autres personnes. Alors, je ne suis pas sûr de la prononciation des mots, c'est Lamas. Mulaney chez Routledge, et ça s'appelle Sociolinguistic Companion, je crois. Et il va publier en 2009 un autre ouvrage qui s'appelle The English Language, avec Louise Mulaney, une fois de plus. Aux presses universitaires d'Édimbourg, il a un ouvrage qui va sortir très bientôt, qui s'appelle Texture, donc qui reprend des éléments de stylistique cognitive en les développant et en insistant plus sur l'aspect esthétique de la chose. Aujourd'hui, Peter Stockwell a accepté de venir nous faire une conférence sur l'identité en sociolinguistique, qui est un domaine que les sociolinguistes, un domaine qui ne va pas de soi en sociolinguistique. Il y a deux camps, ceux qui sont pour la discussion de l'identité et ceux qui ne sont pas vraiment pour. Donc je laisse la parole à Peter Stockwell pour cette conférence.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have said this already this afternoon to the people who attended my seminars over the last 2 days, and congratulations on your willpower. Some of what I have to say they will recognise because I talked about this afternoon, and some of the particular comments in here I have stolen from their comments from this afternoon as well. So this is a cooperative work of plagiarism as well as my own hand. As Manuel said, I sort of feel a bit schizophrenic sometimes because I have a line in sociolinguistics and a line in cognitive linguistics, and I work in an English literature department largely. So that's three personalities at least, and it makes me feel a bit strange. But it also puts me in an interesting position that I see lots of different developments in different disciplines that seem to me to converge. So what I want to do today, this evening, is talk about some of those convergences, and in fact argue for a convergence. I particularly want to talk about identity because within sociolinguistics, identity is a big issue at the moment. It's probably the big issue, the big debatable issue in sociolinguistics. At the last N-Wave conference in the United States, there was a big debate. I mean, I distinguish it by calling it a debate. It fell into a bit of a fight between William Labov and the disciples of variationism on the one hand, and people like Penny Eckert and social constructivists on the other, arguing not about identity, but whether identity existed as a sociolinguistic concept, whether it was legitimate actually to talk about identity at all. And people like Penny Eckert were arguing very strongly that identity should be the research paradigm, the research objective in sociolinguistics, and furthermore arguing that it always had been, but implicitly. On the other hand, people like Labov and Trudgill in articles since, Peter Trudgill, have argued that identity, since it was implicit in sociolinguistics already, cannot be the object of investigation, since all of the other aspects of identity, as they conceive them as termed in social variables, should be the object of the research. So we have different definitions of identity across the history of sociolinguistics, starting off with the variationist program, where identity is defined in terms of social variables, for example, like those, and of course others, as we were as was pointed out to me this afternoon, there are plenty of other variables that fall off this list. So we have social variables like geography or gender or age or race and so on, that have been the subject of major sociolinguistic studies right from its modern birth, I guess in the 1960s, certainly in the American tradition. Of course, the geographical basis of sociolinguistic identity goes back into dialectology and has a longer history than modern sociolinguistics. But these other aspects, certainly when they're treated as social variables within a variationist paradigm, are relatively newly researched. Variables of gender, of age, of race, of ethnicity, class politics, occupation, family type, but structure and sort of cultural sense of the family. Definition of identity as being absolutely, definitely, positively not that other bunch of people, or a more negative definition that I'm just not one of those. So the difference between, for example, a Basque person of a particular political persuasion being very much not Spanish, actively not Spanish, as a definition of being Basque, compared with, I don't know, a Canadian person being just not American, but not in the same way as the vehemence of a Basque person not being Spanish. So that's the distinction between those. And these have all been different major research areas within sociolinguistics. There are big studies that can be attached along most of these. Excuse me. And as I say, other categories as well. As I guess I'm trying to go through a history of sociolinguistics here. So if this is sort of 1960s and 70s, what you start getting towards the end of the 1970s and 1980s is an emphasis not so much on taking a social variable and mapping it against a linguistic variable, a language feature, but more of a social network sense. And this corresponds with the move in linguistics generally to pragmatics, to that there are more tools and more diversity theoretically in pragmatics, or at least the 70s I see as the big explosion of pragmatic interest in applied linguistics at least. So in the social network approach we get, well, the idea of social networks itself. I'm thinking of Leslie Milroy's study in Belfast, where the patterns of particular small groupings of people were seen to have different reinforcing effects on particular linguistic features. So in the Belfast example, there was a group of young Catholic women, working class, all lived in the same area of Belfast, all had husbands or partners who were unemployed and around and not at work during the day, all had children that went to the same school, attended the same church, lived in the same Catholic parish, and because of that they all lived near each other. So they all knew each other in lots of different ways. It was a very dense, very multiplex, very tight social network. By contrast with people only a few miles away, young Protestant women living in a different area whose husbands were all in work and who were a much more disparate group. And Milroy found that linguistic innovation was much more likely to happen in the dense group than in the loose group. And not only that, but any innovation that happened was much more likely to persist in the dense group than in the loose group. So the social network, the strength of the social network was a norm reinforcement mechanism. But you can see how that cuts across with these isolated features. It's a completely different way of looking at a person in their social context. And these other forms, like the community of practice, which is largely associated with Penny Eckert, the notion of speech communities, largely associated with Deborah Cameron, even the idea of causal names, which actually comes from Laboff originally, back in the 60s, in his work on street gangs in America. The idea that people were central to the gang and other people were, it's his word, lames. They were peripheral to the gang. Blended into sociological study of language in Ron Scollan's work on a nexus of analysis that draws largely on Pierre Bourdieu's work. All of these are different forms, it seems to me, of an ethnographic influence on applied linguistics, on sociolinguistics specifically. So we have a a shift, it seems to me, in sociolinguistics itself. Now, variationism doesn't disappear. It's still a very strong and growing and developing and strengthening movement within sociolinguistics. But these new ways of looking at the same problems start to emerge. Even more recently, out of this social network notion, approaches based on social constructivism have appeared. These are, again, associated with Penny Eckert, I think, and other people, based on interpersonal pragmatics, so notions of politeness. This is a particularly strong area amongst those people who work in gender or sexuality research, and they're much more interested in these sort of fluid ideas of identity. But that's a long way, this is a long way from this sort of approach. It's quite a different way of looking at it. So we have initially a quantitative variationism, then I guess an ethnography of language, and finally an approach that emphasises social meaningfulness, the constructs of social meaning. And the people who do this really strongly believe that identity is the thing to talk about, and the people who do this largely don't. And that's the split, it seems to me. Now, all of these are to do with the link between how these are represented and how these are grammaticalized or articulated in language, are to do with indexicality. That is, how these are signalled, how these are pointed to in the world. So there is a connection, it seems to me, across all of these, in a very broad, general sense, that means they're not absolutely different ways of doing the thing. Nevertheless, as I said, there are arguments within sociolinguistics against identity altogether, arguing that these are the things that should be investigated, and these need to be kept separately from linguistic performance in order to be able to say definitely whether a particular linguistic feature is variable because of age or because of class or because of occupation. And people who take this strong variationist line simply think that, well, in particular, a social constructivist view can't demonstrate anything, and that therefore it's not worth, it's pointless trying to blend all of these things together. So it's a fundamental difference. Okay, let me stop talking about sociolinguistics for a minute and put a different hat on and speak about identity from the viewpoint of psychology. Because psychologists are interested, not surprisingly, in identity as well. And in fact, you may say that the notion of identity is a much more long-standing research interest in psychology. Psychology this is very crude, but psychology in general, for almost the whole of the last century, has fallen into a debate about whether identity is a product of traits, that is, threads of personality, or types, whether you can categorize a whole person or different sorts of people as different types. And there are different sorts of applications for these. So people interested in personality traits tend to be clinical psychologists, and people interested in personality types tend to be therapeutic psychologists, actually of a Jungian variety, but there's that distinction. In general, this is variable, but in general there are 5 overall differences, 5 overall personality traits that cluster together. First of all, the idea of openness. So, are you, as an individual, open to new and varied experience in all sorts of different domains? Or are you a closed person? Are you not interested in those things, not open to new ideas? Are you a conscientious person? Are you organised? Do you plan things? Do you display moral behaviour? Or are you a capricious person? Do you do things spontaneously? Are you disorganised? Thirdly, are you an extrovert? Extroversion is probably the oldest personality trait identified in psychology back in the late 19th century, and in the modern era. Are you enthusiastic, driven, energetic, optimistic, positive, sociable? Are you all those things? Or, by contrast, are you introverted? All of these have their opposites, of course. Fourthly, are you agreeable? I like the phrasing. Are you agreeable? Are you compassionate? Are you empathetic? Do you get along with people? Or are you solipsistic? Do you prefer to do your own thing? And finally, spelling out the acronym OCEAN, which is possibly why this has become a popular way of looking at this in psychology. Are you neurotic in the psychological sense rather than in the pop sense? Are you someone who gets pessimistic easily, depressed easily? Not necessarily clinically depressed, but just down. Are you anxious a lot? Do you feel vulnerable? In other words, are you emotionally unstable as opposed to having an emotional stability? Now these are all the 5, there's lots of others, variations and sophistications within this, obviously within psychology. But psychologists tend to see these patterns and these dimensions as being the way that they talk about personalities and how identity is constructed as a thing. And the movement in most recent psychology is that these aren't fixed. So, you know, this is where big multinational corporations that like psychometric testing, in order to say, you are this sort of person, we'll give you this job. You are not, we don't want you. It's very old-fashioned. Most of the most recent work in psychology, by recent I mean the last 20 years, deals with identity as being much more fluid, as changeable. So, you know, you can be extrovert in some contexts and introverted in others. They're still talking about the dimension, but the dimension is movable and dynamic. And equally, all of these don't always line up. In fact, it's an accident of the acronym that these generally positive things are put with a negative thing. I mean, really, if that should be the other way around. But then it wouldn't be so neat. So, you know. So they don't always line up. And in fact, you get complexes of personality, of identity, that are people who are open but introverted. Well, maybe not that one. Conscientious but introverted. I think that's me. Most of the time. It's true of academics generally, I think, that only sometimes you are extrovert and the rest of the time you need to be introverted, otherwise you would never actually do any reading or research or work. So you do have to switch, I think, as well. Excuse me. These two sets of approaches to identity then can be brought together. There are some areas of common ground between the two. And at this point I want to try and find those areas of common ground by drawing on some things that we've learned from cognitive science recently. The first thing that I think we need is the notion of prototypicality. Because as soon as you talk about categorization of any sort, the notion from cognitive linguistics, especially, of prototypicality needs to apply. And it seems to me this helps explain the fact that these absolutely hard categories, especially in psychology until fairly recently, are dynamic, are radial, are variable, are dynamic at the edges. The second thing is the notion that I take from Ray Gibbs, the cognitive linguist Ray Gibbs, who's referenced on the handout, that, well, according to Gibbs, all concepts and all linguistic realizations of them are assembled as you need them. So, contrary to the sort of old schematic notion that you have everything fixed in little templates that you run out for each occasion, that are relatively fixed, Gibbs shows some evidence to suggest that only those templates that you use absolutely every single day are fixed like that, and even there can be moved around. And that your mode of expression, the registers that you use in certain contexts, and in fact the way that you encode yourself and your thinking seems to be much more provisional than it has seemed in the past, including the way that you express your own identity as a personality. The next thing I think is useful from cognitive science is the notion of a deictic stance. That is, how you present yourself linguistically to the world along these dimensions, lexicalized and grammaticalized in these sorts of ways. I'm not going to go through all of those because it would take too long. But the notion of where you are and how you present yourself, crucially, and how other people see you on the basis of how you linguistically present yourself, is clearly important in this debate. It's something that I call deictic braiding, to try and get the notion that even though these are analytically useful separate categories, actually every example of language use can be analysed along each and all of these dimensions every time. So instead of having a separate set of deictic markers, almost everything is braided together between you and the person to whom you're talking. And there's also a sense, it seems to me, that again from the cognitive psychology in this case, that the more you pay attention to the person talking to you, the more you try and psychologize them and try to understand why they're saying the things that they're saying, the more you lose, necessarily, the sense of yourself. So there's a decay of your own personality if you're paying real attention to the deictic centre that you're having to construct on the other end of the deictic braid. Sorry, it's getting a bit quiet, but you get the idea. And clearly it's a figure ground problem with it, well, not a problem, it's a figure ground phenomenon to do with attention. You can't pay attention to both ends at the same time equally. So your attention goes that way and you lose yourself to a certain extent. And I'll show some examples of that in a second. In fact, now. It strikes me that one of the grounds, and these are the three examples on your handout, one of the grounds for being able to examine the convergences of sociolinguistics and psychology, especially cognitive psychology, is in the notion of accommodation. Now, it's an old thing in sociolinguistics. I think the original work on accommodation in the sociological and sociolinguistic tradition happens back in the early 1970s. But it's always been seen by especially variationist sociolinguists as something different, as social psychology, as really psychology, as really to do with something a bit much less analytical than the sorts of things they were doing. And there's a big tradition of looking at speech accommodation in particular over the last 30 or 40 years. The notion essentially is a bit like how I was describing deictic braiding and decay. The idea is that if you put two people together who have any linguistic differences, they will move towards each other linguistically. So if you have someone, let's say, with an American accent and someone with a British accent, you get a convergence of the two. And it's not always balanced. In fact, it's almost never balanced. So they don't meet in the middle. You will often get one movement towards the other. And those movements are on the basis of things like the perceived power relation, or the asserted power relation, or their gender positioning, or many other factors. But you get a shift. So, for example, it's a common phenomenon that a British person with an English accent in particular, rather than Scottish or Irish, will start to creep towards rhoticity when talking to an American, because it's a very strong marker of Americanness. There are observable gender differences in this, and cultural ones. So, in Britain, if you get a man and a woman together, all other things being equal, the woman will move her accent closer, the man will move his accent closer to the woman. The man will move more. In America, it's the other way around. Women move more. American women move more than American men. So why that is grounds for lots of speculation. But there's to do with American culture and gender relations in those two countries, I guess. But these things are observable and measurable and are clearly there. What we've got here is, this is an example from Benia in 2004. It's quite a famous study, and it's quoted in a review of Identity by Buchholz and Hall 3 or 4 years ago. On your handout. Benia presents this data, and Buchholz and Hall present this data in order to show code switching, in this case between Tongan and English. This is a marketplace in Tonga, on the island of Tonga, off the coast of New Zealand. This is a second-hand market. So these people are both Tongans, both mother tongue Tongan speakers. And this is the conversation. Let me read it out. Apologies for my Tongan pronunciation if anybody's an expert in the room. Sai ia kia ko, Sonia, which means looks good on you, Sonia. Yeah, if it fits. Nice. And then there's a long 10-second pause. What size is it? 8. Oh. Too small. Howie malia, ya mea. It might fit you because it looks big. You? Yeah. The waist, look. I know. I think it's one of those that it has to show the belly button. No way. Ah, ha, 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 ha. That's the in thing in New Zealand now. Even my kids say, Mummy, see, it has to show the... I say, no, no, ha, 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 because that's the look now. Now, clearly there's something very odd going on here, in that they're speaking largely in English. That's the main point that Buchholz and Hall are making, that these are two Tongan speakers speaking in a Tongan marketplace to each other, and they're largely speaking English, apart from bits of Tongan at the beginning. Excuse me. The reason, according to the sociolinguists, that they're doing this is that English, especially New Zealand influenced English, is regarded as modern and cosmopolitan and sophisticated, much more than their own speech. And even though they're in a second-hand market, this is a fashion conversation. It's not exactly about couture, but it's about posh dresses. So they adopt the English on the seller's part in order to make the garment look more sophisticated, and on the customer's part in order not to look like a peasant. So you know they're both trying to go for this thing. Even more that you don't see on this, but is evident in the recording and in the original article, is that where they speak English, they're adopting a New Zealand accent. So there's lots of centralisation of front vowels going on, high front vowels. So I don't know, in particular words like 8, and so I've got to say this because I centralise a bit naturally anyway in my accent. In 8, fit and mean, you get something like 8, fit and mean. So it's much more, sounds like New Zealand English, and they're going for that as well. Now, as I said, this is being presented as an example of code switching, but it seems to me that treating this or looking at this as an example of accommodation actually gets into it much more interestingly as well, without ignoring the code switching that's going on. What's particularly interesting and strange about this is that normally in accommodation theory, all the data is about 2 or 3 people, and the convergence, the accommodation, is towards one of the people in the room. So there's a shift to whoever it is that's dominating or seen as the most attractive, in the general sense, person in the room. What we've got here is there's no New Zealand person there at all. There's no English-speaking mother tongue person there at all. What they're both aspiring to or shifting to is not each other, but a third person. In fact, a fictional person. Their idealisation of a or sophisticated, international, cosmopolitan New Zealand speaker that's neither of them. So in fact, they're sort of accommodating somewhere else, which is odd, strikes me. This is also very temporary. This only happens in the marketplace. They don't do this sort of thing elsewhere, or not in lots of other contexts. And of course, what happens is that the Tongan bits actually disappear at the point where they get more fluent. So there are lots of long pauses here, especially the 10-second one, as you heard when I read it, trying to get the right pause in. And here it's much more fast and much more fluent, and the Tongan disappears from here onwards. And they encode each other, of course, in the speech, socially. So from being sellers and presenting themselves as cosmopolitan, important New Zealand English speakers, they also position themselves as well, actually, as in a family here, but with children having authority in fashion matters. So there's a whole set of social relationship being encoded at the same time. Excuse me. It seems to me that you can account for this using just traditional sociolinguistic theory, but you can also account for it, at least equally, if you pay attention to the psychology of what's going on with these two people. Especially since you need that extra psychological dimension to talk about the fact that they're not accommodating towards a model that they've got in front of them, but they're accommodating towards a mental model, an idealisation that they carry with them. A person, in other words, that isn't there. Now let me look at another example of that. This is an individual example. Let me look at a group example. This is the next example on your handout. I've said here African American English speakers. In fact, the two guys here talking are Korean Americans. The reason I put that head in there is that the English they are using is an African American variety of English, in spite of the fact that they are Asian Americans. Let me read the passage. So this is Jim. I think white people just don't keep it real, and that's why that's true, man. Because that's why they always backstabbing, like my roommate who wasn't going to pay the last month's rent. White. He kicked us out of the prototypical whitey. Yeah, man. No social skills. But that's not true for everyone, I don't think. Because all those ghetto whiteys in my neighbourhood, I think they're cool. Now, again, this is from Chun's research, also quoted by Buckholst and Paul. And again, they're using this to show that, these two are, as I said, Korean, ethnically Korean. And they're talking about white people, and particularly they're talking about the racism perceived of that group in relation to them. Now, they don't have a ready-made stereotype of Asian American English. Nowhere near as strong as the stereotype of Black American English, of African American English, which is widespread, very much studied, both academically and popularly, appears in lots of different domains, has a real objectiveness to it, in a way that Asian American English doesn't, and is hugely symbolically important in America, in a way that Asian American English isn't, and is more monolithic in America, in a way that Asian American English, we should really be talking about the Asian American Englishes of various different types. Whereas African American English, I mean, the African is largely political correctness, and it used to be called Black English, and actually that's the monolithicness of it, that there are common features of Black English from north to south and east to west to a certain extent, across the whole continent, that are much more homogeneous than they are not homogeneous. So these two ethnic Korean speakers adopt African American features to signal their difference from white culture, which is what they're talking about. Some of the features they use, like idiomatic phrases, keep it real. Idiomatic lexis, like whitey and cool. I know cool is common in American English generally, not common in British English even, with people of a certain age. But it's where it originates that I'm interested in. African American tags like man, again, that's moved more widely into the culture. The pronunciation of yeah, man, or that can't do that. The way I did it the first time. Even, most stereotypically, copular deletion or zero copular. Where are we? They're always backstabbing. So not they are, they're always backstabbing. And the reduction of that final in to stab in, which is common in American English generally, of course. Other similar contractions like gunner. The clefting and fronting at the end, because all those ghetto whiteys in my neighbourhood, headline, I think they're cool. And that's a very characteristic feature of this language variety as well. So all of those are there, there's no question that they're there, but they're not absolutely going for an imitation of this speech variety. They had lots of opportunities to use other stereotypical features of Black American English that they didn't use. For example, they had lots of places where they could do consonant deletion, but they don't. So, for example, the t on just is pronounced, where in, if you like, a thorough African American English person, you would get just don't, or that's why, and you get but they are pronouncing the t, and there's quite a lot of those. That's true. They don't say that. So they don't do that when they have the opportunity to do it. Last month's as well, where's that? There, there's a T there. They don't drop any of them. The copular deletion isn't thorough. So although there's one gone there, that one is definitely there. It's definitely there because of the rhoticity, so you can hear the it's not just it would get lost. In other words, they're moving towards an African-American English variety, but they're not entirely there. They don't go all the way. They don't imitate it entirely. They just do it enough to signal that they're adopting a speech pattern because of the topic. Now again, it seems to me that thinking about this as accommodation, as psychologically as accommodation, gets you a bit further than the plain sociolinguistic account of it. Again, because of the unusualness of the topic and the oddity of it and the provisionalness of it, this is a contingent assembly. It's only put together for this purpose, actually for this semantic field, domain rather. Again, like the Tongan speakers, they're aiming for a prototype that's not, for an idealisation that's not their own. These two people, well, more than two, this is a collection of people, are all from the same speech community. None of them are black Americans. So there's nobody in the room who they're copying. They're going for, again, this idealisation, this fictionalisation, this third other thing. Not the other person. Excuse me. The last example, it seems to me, is one that you really cannot account for, either just sociolinguistically or just psychologically. You need a blend of the two. And this, for me, is the clinching argument. And this is where I need to rely on the technology. This person is, I'm sure some of you recognise, is Steve McLaren, the former England football manager, who was sacked after a run of such bad results that England did not qualify for the European Championships. Still a bone of misery to some of us. Look, I have a particular attachment, association with Steve McLaren, in that before he was the England football manager, he was the manager of Middlesbrough Football Club, which is where I'm from, so I sort of feel a double relationship with him. We're in a dense social network. After he was sacked as England manager, after a period of mourning, he became manager of a Dutch side called FC 20. And so he'd only been there a matter of weeks. Now, FC 20 had qualified for the Champions League, the European football competition, the year before, not due to McLaren. So he's now managing a team in the Champions League, and this is the interview with him on Dutch television. Now, I'm going to play you it in a minute. But this is an account of the interview. This is actually the text from Sky News online. But I could have reproduced, I don't know, 9 or 10 newspaper reports that were broadly identical to this, that came out around the same time. So here's the newspaper report, just to give you a sense of what's going on here. This is the headline: Stop, Max gone double Dutch. As you might know, Dutch, the word Dutch in British English means anything that's a bit questionable. It's a little bit racist, but it comes from our long rivalry with the Dutch over the last sort of 5 centuries, really. So, you know, double Dutch means it's not understandable. Just like a Dutch queue is not a queue, or a Dutch treat is something you pay for yourself. A Dutch auction is, you know, is not really an auction; it's where it's all fixed. Anyway, okay, let's ignore that for a second. Here's the article. Steve McLaren ditched his Yorkshire accent. He's actually from Hull, which is not far from my own voice. Steve McLaren ditched his Yorkshire accent and began speaking with a Dutch twang during bizarre television interviews. The former England boss, now manager of FC 20 in the Netherlands, adopted broken English while answering questions. This is the newspaper understanding of broken English, not a sociolinguist understanding of broken English. He's not like generating a new pidginization form. Among the gems were, we are not just what you call underdogs, but massive underdogs. Everything is there for a surprise. You'll hear that in a second. At one point he said, mid-sentence, the only thing you can do. And he added, on the night maybe we get the luck. This was despite the Dutch interviewer speaking in perfect English and the fact he's only been in the job a few weeks. McLaren, speaking ahead of his team's Champions League defeat to Arsenal, was sacked as England boss after failing to qualify for the European Championships. His new accent had puzzled viewers on YouTube who have delivered their own harsh verdict. Pretty harsh. I mean, he's absolutely slated on the website, down there, in very strong terms. However, it is not unusual for footballers to eventually shed their native tongue after spells in England. Dane Peter Schmeichel famously spoke with a Mancunian accent during his time with Manchester United, and compatriot Jan Molby sounded like a Scouser while with Liverpool. So they pointed this out. There's the clip address if you want it. These are quotations from other newspaper sites to give you the sense. I did this rather than do some phonetic notation, I apologise. Arsenal becomes Arsenal, and the Champions League fixture against them is big news now in English media. Champions League, Liverpool or Arsenal, I thought one of them we would draw, and it is Arsenal, I think. To experience big games, Champions League, Arsenal, the Emirates, that's the name of their stadium, will be fantastic for the players. Not just for now, but for the future as well. I think we are not just what you call underdogs, but massive underdogs. Now the newspapers are doing this spelling, they're doing spelling things. You don't expect a bit of IPA and Sky News, you know. So this is how they represent it. And of course when they do this, they over-egg it, they exaggerate a bit. So as you'll hear in a minute, McLaren isn't doing shh, but he is definitely affricating those sibilants. I think you can hear it. Let me see if it'll play. Otherwise I'm going to have to do this myself. So let's just let that load a second.
I sort of knew when I came here and Champions League, Liverpool or Arsenal, I thought maybe one of them we would draw, and it is Arsenal. I think one of the toughest teams in the draw, and I think it will be very, very difficult for our players, but also a great experience. We have a young team, and to experience big games, Champions League, Arsenal, at home, the Emirates, will be fantastic for the players, not just for now, but in the future as well.
Okay, just pause it a second. So you can hear the phonetic stuff he's doing. He's doing the he's even doing that rhotic players to a certain extent. Bear in mind he's from Yorkshire, so this is none of this is part of his actual accent. He's even too old for doing any of these developments that Manuel was talking about to me earlier, where you get some of these patterns in English youth. But he's even doing that thing that British people do with foreigners, where he's simplifying the English, and it's a good thing to do. Sometimes we just talk louder. But what he's doing here is making clauses simple, actually in some cases getting rid of verb phrases altogether and just listing nouns, Arsenal, the Emirates. You know. He's telling the story just by listing noun phrases. But he's using the same sort of politeness hedges that a foreigner who doesn't speak English very well would use, because they don't have the vocabulary to say exactly what they want to say. You can hear him doing that. And he's articulating every word. So there's no contractions like you would normally get in his Yorkshire voice. He doesn't say it's, it is. He doesn't say we'll, he says we will. They're all spread out because he's talking as clearly as he can to this Dutch person who's interviewing.
It must be very special for you personally.
Yeah, of course. It's one of the reasons I came, because a good team and they qualified Champions League, so it's one of the reasons I came to draw Arsenal, one of the big teams. Is exciting for everybody.
Arsenal is a big team. What are your chances against Arsenal?
I say, I think we are not just what you call underdogs, but massive underdogs. I think there is no expectations for FC20. So,
I think that's brilliant. When he says, this is where I really have trouble with. What does he say? I think. Where is it? I think we are not just what you call underdogs, but massive underdogs. Now what's curious about this is it's not what you, the Dutch person, call, it's what we, the British people, call massive underdogs. Underdogs is an English idiom, and he's gone so far towards the Dutch that he is now Dutch. He's sort of switched didactic positions. His own personality is completely gone. In order to say what you call. Now, that is a phrase that Dutch people would use to the English if they're not quite sure of the idiom. Here's McLaren using it in response to the Dutch woman who doesn't call anybody an underdog because she's Dutch.
Everything is therefore a surprise. We have nothing to lose. So we go into the game, nice and relaxed, enjoy the experience.
But you know the English football by heart.
I do, we know the team very well and Arsenal very well. So it is nothing new. And I think the players, they know all the Arsenal players and they watch them Premier League. I think they are one of the top teams in Europe. And it will be good for our players to play against that quality because anything after that may be a little easier.
You have a very talented group, but they don't have a lot of experience in big European games. Is it going to be a problem?
We will see on the night. Some people, they grow with the experience, and I hope the players will take.
Okay. He even does that thing that as a British person you do, or as a well, not just a British person, as someone going for a language you don't speak very well does. He increases the use of gesture to reinforce what he's saying and draws pictures and does things. But he also, even when you would do this if you don't know the word in the other language, where you go, but no Yorkshire person would ever go, that's just not a Yorkshire movement. Nobody would do that. I think it's not an English movement in general, but it's a Dutch thing. I've seen French people do it as well, but that's something that you see in Holland. You see people doing it. So there's McLaren doing that. So we've got lots of supportive gestures, the disfluency that's covered by sound effects, the non-ellipsis of words, the simplification of clauses, the piling up of noun phrases, the affrication of the sibilants, what else? The rhoticity, the odd shift of what you call, and other idioms that don't sound like ordinary English conversational syntax. Now it strikes me that it's very, very difficult to account for what McLaren's doing in traditional sociolinguistic terms. You've got to talk about the psychology of how he's presenting his identity in this context. It's an interview on Dutch television with a Dutch person in front of him. But he's clearly also going for something beyond her. He's not just copying her. When she does the rhoticity and the shirt, but she didn't do half of all these other things that he's doing. He's picked those up from somewhere else. And it strikes me that the notion of didactic decay is useful here. That he's moving so far along the accommodation towards this other idealisation in his head that he loses the sense of himself as an English person. And I think the clincher for that is that bit where he says, what you call. And now he couldn't possibly say that if he still had a sense of himself, of which side of the didactic fence he was actually sitting on. Click here, otherwise some other YouTube thing is going to come on. So finally I want to talk about, I just want to summarise some of these convergences. The convergences, of course, are from sociolinguistics, from cognitive linguistics, and from cognitive psychology. Now, I know there are relationships, strong relationships between these two, but I'm treating them separately. If you put these together, if you try and assimilate them, it seems to me there is common ground, a common ground that we might call something like applied cognitive sociolinguistics. Well, that would be a better phrase in anyone who chose to write the book of that. And it strikes me that it's a necessary thing, because the question of identity in sociolinguistics is a question that cannot be answered, fundamentally because it's asking the wrong question. The debate will simply go back and forth to say, I think we should be talking about this, I don't agree, I don't think we should. And I don't see any resolution of that, unless the research question itself is reframed in terms of saying, how are these aspects of identity, whatever you think that is, reframed? How does what we know about, in this case, cognitive psychology, help us to talk about social features of language? And crucially, I think, for cognitive science, which is insufficiently social, how do we use the insights, particularly from sociolinguistics, in order to do cognitive linguistics better? Thank you very much.